You. Hey there, Jay. How are you?
Yo, hello, how's it going?
Going well. Going well.
Good.
What kind of questions do you have for Michael?
Wow, well, I don't know, just hearing you, I thought of quite a few. Well, you're really like, you sound really well read and even more well spoken, you know? I hope you can, give me some sort of, I don't know, personal answer to this, because it's sort of a personal question. You said you call yourself a Christian. Um, And you were previously talking about like arguments for the existence of God. I wonder how you bridge the theist like existence of God. Like, okay, someone is like ultimately hosting like the ultimate information bases for us to be able to measure them at some later point, like sort of thing. But how do you transfer that into the fact that Jesus Christ was somehow in connection to this to the degree of being able to um, come back to life, whatever. I'm not
hmm
sure what that means, you know? Like, what do you mean by I'm not.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, I just use natural theology, cosmological, moral, consciousness arguments for the existence of a God. How I get to Christianity is then the evidence specific to Christianity. So, I start with the New Testament. That's the basis of the Christian faith. I think there's plenty of good evidence to suggest the New Testament is reliable. I'm currently working on some research to come to that soon and back that up even more. So that's where I start. And then what Christians do is we argue for the
What do you
resurrection
mean?
itself.
What do you mean by reliable? I'm sorry, I'm not very familiar with technical
So the good
vocabulary.
question. That's fine. Reliable tends to mean a written. What it's basically telling you. It's very unlikely to have been corrupted over time. That it's goes back to what the original authors thought and taught. It's more likely that they would have been experienced along these events they were dealing with, like the ministry of Jesus, his crucifixion, his betrayal and arrest, finding his tomb empty. So I would say it's reliable to what was originally written in the first century, and it likely came from reliable sources that were close to Jesus. That's what I mean by reliable.
Right, like it wasn't made up fantasy. It was meant to be
Yeah,
nonfiction work. You mean?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they're Greco-Roman
Right.
biographies, and so then how do I get to truth from there? Well, then it's the evidence
Yeah.
for the resurrection, and so a lot of historians wrestle with this. This is a big debate in New Testament scholarship, which is how did Christianity get started? It doesn't fit with the cultural background at the time period. So there were many messianic movements in the first century, but all of them basically ended in the Messiah figure dying. And when he died, the Jews would scatter and they get themselves a new Messiah. The Christians did something different, which is that they claimed that not only that was the death of their Messiah supposed to happen, it was ordained by God, and it proved he was the Messiah and proved he was God himself. So the Christians went around preaching that their Messiah was physically resurrected. That's unlike any Jewish messianic expectation of the time period. So historians have to wrestle with this. How does Christianity come out of this Jewish background, which was totally unlike what the Christians believed and taught? And so when you start getting into that, you start studying the facts like, well, a lot of historians will agree that the disciples claimed that they saw the risen Jesus. Not a spirit, but they believe they actually saw a physically risen Jesus. Not only that, skeptics converted. So James, the brother of Jesus, was not a disciple of Jesus, but after the resurrection, he's now the leader of the Jerusalem church and preaching that his own brother is God. You also have Paul, who was a skeptic and a persecutor, who's for some reason decided he also believed Jesus physically rose from the dead in contradiction with his pretty orthodox Second Temple Jewish beliefs at the time. And so he becomes a proponent of Christianity. You also have to wrestle with the fact that it's most likely the tomb would have been found empty. And so there's a lot of issues here. The biggest thing that we're trying to explain in history, how did the Christian movement come out of first or second temple Judaism? Because it's not in the background. It's unlike any other messianic movement of the time. It doesn't fit with Jewish expectations of the Messiah.
Okay, so real quick, let me just shoot back your argument and let me know if I got this wrong. So you're saying um, it's so weird that Christianity had such a like strong movement, and therefore it's very likely that a very like phenomenon, like very abnormal event occurred, such as the resurrection of a living human body. And there's also accounts of all these people that were known doubters to have converted, and this leads you to the belief that Jesus Christ was the Son of God.
Well, I would say it's more about the claims, not about the movement. The Christians made pretty wild claims for their time period that did not fit with the background.
Yeah.
So they claimed that Jesus was the Messiah, that he physically resurrected from the dead, and that they actually had appearances of him. His tomb was found empty, and so the body cannot be accounted for. So it's the claims that don't fit with the Jewish background, and that's what needs to be explained. And given what I would say is given a lot of all the data, when we take into all the data that I go through in my series, naturalistic explanations that attempt to account for this data become ad hoc. They start multiplying assumptions beyond necessity. They posit too many things to try to explain all this data. And given parsimony, the Christianity offers the simplest explanation, namely that Jesus rose from the dead.
No way. That's not the simplest explanation. Come on, you're telling me that?
Why?
Okay, how did he rise from the dead?
How did he rise from the dead?
Yeah, like how, like what went on biologically, man? Like what was going wrong and what got fixed, and how did it get fixed? Was it physical?
Well,
was it spiritual? Like how did it go about? You know, like you have those questions. I feel
we're confusing two different aspects of an explanation here. So the how and the what. So, for example, scientists do not know how quantum gravity works, but they know that it has to, and it's going to be the simplest. Right now, theory of everything is the simplest explanation, that quantum mechanics has to explain gravity. They just don't know how. Likewise, I may not be able to explain the actual supernatural effects that are taking place, but I can still argue what most likely happened. So you just think it's how and the what.
It falls into the most likely argument type of Occam's razor. I'm not sure if that's the right type of phrasing, but it's just the most likely event, you think?
Yes, and
you don't think it could have been like a ploy? Like someone stole the body? Someone stole the body.
Well, that's a good question. Let's talk about that. So we're talking about, first of all, at a time during Passover. This is when the entire city would have been flooded with pilgrims. So if anyone's going to steal the body, there's going to be a lot of people there. It's also been buried in a tomb that was known, and it was in the Sanhedrin headquarters. So this is on Sanhedrin property, the very people that wanted Jesus dead. So it's very unlikely they would have stolen the body. The Jews didn't want him to resurrect. The disciples I don't know.
It sounds more likely
of embarrassment
than like that's, I don't know. It's just absolute phenomenon, the resurrection of the dead. You know. Also, all right. How about one other problem? Because it just seems non-local. It just seems like, why all that power in such a small moment? Like, I guess you can probably think of a backing, but yeah, go ahead.
Here's what you're doing. Don't assume naturalism is true. I would say let's start with agnosticism. People will say, well, the resurrection is not likely because it's a miracle. It's a supernatural event. But again, if we start with agnosticism,
it's super possible.
Okay.
I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm super open to it being possible. I just think it sounds more possible that some dude stole the body. Like, that just sounds more likely. Like, sure, it would have been hard, but like, come on, like, crazier things have happened. I feel like it'd be harder to say that he just resurrected by some absolutely literal magical event to us right now, right? Because I think magic is just the science we don't understand yet. I mean, like I said, because we don't understand it yet. In our vocabulary, in this English we speak today in 2023, it would be considered magical if I could get stabbed by like a lance through the heart, get thrown, done the whole 9 yards of what they said they did, and then thrown in a cave, and then pulled out, and then just started walking and talking, and then left up to heaven and sat next to my dad and left off into the clouds. That just sounds... It sounds like sounds symbolic. It sounds symbolic. It sounds like you miss the point if you take the literal point of view. You know what I'm trying to say? I'm not saying I don't agree with it, because I actually really do agree with it. I feel like it's taking away from what was meant to have to give the childish interpretation of the literalness of like the dude standing up and really living, because what does it even mean to die, right? Like his heart stopped, did his head
Are you
stop?
gonna let
Like,
me respond
you know,
ever?
sorry, yeah, no, my bad.
Okay. All right, I'm gonna respond now. Okay,
Yeah, no,
couple of things.
this will be the end.
You
My
basically.
bad. Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned it being magical. I mean, again, this seems to presuppose that it's more likely a natural event can explain it. And again, for me, and we're going to use the criteria of history. It's got to have explanatory scope, explanatory power. It's got to have plausibility, and it's got to be the least ad hoc. The least ad hoc cannot work in qualities; it can only work in quantity of assumptions. The resurrection has the least amount of assumptions there. Natural explanations, like someone stealing the body, you have to posit that somebody wanted to steal the body. They had the means and the motive to. They had the ability to. They were also able to sneak away with the body. They start to multiply assumptions beyond necessity to the point where we have to start positing. When we start positing people like the disciples or the Jews or the Romans, they adding in specific people as to who would steal the body, it just seems even more likely because you had to add assumptions and motivations there as well. So we're already making an explanation that is very ad hoc. And when you talk about the symbolic aspect, that's not what the early Christians believe. Paul is very clear in 1 Corinthians 15 that this is a physical resurrection. Jesus was buried, after he died, and that was raised, and he appeared to the disciples, and last of all, he appeared to Paul. In that chapter, he talks about how it was a physical resurrection. People try to get mixed up because they'll say things like it was sown a natural body, it was raised a spiritual body. However, when you look at how Paul defines those words in his own letters, natural refers to unenlightened, spiritual refers to enlightened, and so he also uses Jewish idioms in there. Very much, most scholars do agree he's talking about a physical resurrection. Our earliest sources speak of Jesus as if he was physically walking around. This was not symbolic for them. If it was symbolic, it would not have been an issue and they would not have been persecuted for this because they were preaching that Jesus actually physically rose from the dead. They were not preaching that he was just exalted to heaven or he was just vindicated by God after his death. They were saying that the tomb was empty, his body is no longer there, and we have seen him risen.
Awesome conversation. Awesome. I do want to move on to the next guys if we could. So, Jay, I appreciate your input. Thanks, Michael, for being so patient.
Appreciate it.
Everything was
If you want to see more, if you check out my YouTube series, The Resurrection of Jesus, I have a 6-part video series. I go through all the data.
Hey, Michael.
Thanks for the
As the other resident Christian around these parts, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
And I was just wanted to quickly ask, since I'm not that familiar with you, sorry in advance. Are you do you hold to a confession? What denomination are you in?
I actually keep that private because I don't. If I do, like half my followers will attack me and half will think I'm now just an apologist for that denomination. And I really just want to be a Christian apologist. Yeah. Okay,
fine. And in your approach to apologetics, what school?
Classical.
Okay, so Sproul. More in the Sproul camp?
I thought he was a presupposition. I don't know.
No,
I take a classical approach. Okay, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I take like the William Lane Craig approach.
Oh, I see. So you're a Molinist?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Cool. I'm just curious. R.C. Sproul actually debated against Bahnsen in the presuppositional argument. He actually makes a classical.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't aware.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I'm a Reformed Christian, so I'm presuppositionalist. But
okay.
Good to meet you. And sorry, keep going on. I didn't mean to entirely interrupt. I just wanted to say hello.
You're good, man.
Yeah,
You're
no
good.
worries.
Thanks for the input. So, Fleur, welcome up. How you doing, man? What you got?
Hello. Can you hear me? Am I audible?
Mm-hmm.
You are
Okay,
audible.
thank you. Perfect. I was wondering, inspiring philosophy, what are your opinions on the aesthetic arguments for God?
Aesthetic arguments?
Yeah.
I've not really used them, to be honestly. I think they can be helpful maybe in a secondary case. I did take a class when I was getting my master's on aesthetics, and I thought going through that class you maybe could make an interesting case. It just seems like at best it could be used as a secondary argument, not as like a main argument for God's existence.
Um, so like, okay, you think it's like best a secondary argument?
Yeah, I think if you're going to
I
argue for some sort of objective sense, yeah.
Well, I think if you're a fan of teleological arguments, you should be a fan of aesthetic arguments because they're kind of similar.
Yeah, I think it could
Especially,
help the teleological argument.
yeah, yeah, okay. So, like in particular, right? Um, teleological arguments, right, are going to rely, um, like on certain like epistemic norms, right? Because of like epistemic like purposefulness. So we're going to say that like a let's say like an entity like in our scientific theories like a electron like commits to some type of epistemic purposefulness and that it coheres to a certain it allows the theory to cohere to a certain epistemic virtue or norm, right? It adds justification.
Hmm.
You could argue that like something like parsimony, right, is an aesthetic value and that aesthetic values require certain unconditionals, right? And then you're going to appeal to some higher like some like transcendental unconditional, which will be like a god, right? So you can do like an argument of degree with it. So we can say that we notice objects, right, have a sense of beauty. These sense of beauties come in degrees. These sense of beauties in the reality are mere conditionals. In order for us to have a conditional rule to evaluate beauty, we must have an unconditional, right? Like a Kantian like critique of pure reason sense. So therefore, there's an unconditional beauty, which is God. Um,
Yeah, my two things I would think about it. One, I'll do a pro and a con here. Pro, I think it does remind me of an argument similar to the moral argument, which is arguing for the moral ideal. So when we picture the moral ideal, we're going to picture an agent that is morally perfect and does everything right. Therefore, we're picturing God, basically, that where the moral goodness is grounded in. My con for that, maybe I would think of it maybe in terms of how William Lane Craig is brought up some things, is like how do we define what would be objective and perfect beauty? You could picture a maximally perfect island that used the analogy I believe that he used. It can always have more palm trees or more dancing girls or more clear, crystal clear ocean. I don't know if you could really ever say that it is actually going to be maximally beautiful. So maybe you could push back in that region that maybe maximal beauty is just sort of a thing that just doesn't exist, and there's subjective preferences for what would qualify as maximum beauty, or that maybe it just never actually reaches that point. So you could always push back, I guess, that maybe some aesthetic aspects do not have to necessarily be grounded in a god.
Well, I would like, I guess, would push back further. I think this actually puts you in a really good position as an idealist to use these arguments, right? Specifically through Schelling and through the works of Schelling, Holderlin, and Novalis. Also Schiller too. Um, those writers in particular, and specifically imagining like aesthetics like purposefulness in the fact that aesthetics do reveal some truth content about nature. So like Schelling's going to say that aesthetics is like a third movement, like some type of sensuous third movement between pure and like practical reason, right? That
Mm.
there's
Yeah.
like some type of like content and form going on there and that it reveals some truth content in nature. So you could argue that, since like it seems to me that natural beauty is purposeful, right? You can make like a teleological argument. So natural beauty is purposeful. Purposeful things require intent. Therefore, like God, I can't think of the rest of the premises, but yeah,
No, I
intent
mean,
requires a mind.
I think if you take the intent route, you argue from intent, you're going to get a better, stronger argument because just arguing from mere description of beauty, I don't think gets you entirely there. But intent, I think, requires a mind. So if you can bridge that with intent, you're going to have a stronger argument.
Yeah, I don't know. I think so like I have another question. What's your opinion on like the works of like Schelling? Um
Schelling, what's for first name?
fuck, is it Friedrich? Schelling. Know a lot of last names. Friedrich
Yeah,
Schelling, yeah.
the name sounds familiar. I may have read something, but nothing rings a bell in terms
Oh,
of
he's an
anything
absolute
recently.
idealist. He's an absolute idealist. Similar into the vein of
Okay.
Hegel.
I may have read him as he contributed a chapter to. It sounds like he may have contributed a chapter to a book I read, but I need to go back and check
Oh,
before I
was it
comment on that stuff.
was
Yeah,
it the oldest systematic program of German idealism?
maybe that does sound familiar. Again, I'd have to go back and check because I
Yeah,
don't have
because
it
that
off the top of my
inspired
head.
like inspired like people like I think maybe it may have inspired Novalis, or I think it might have been inspired by Novalis. A novel. I was also like wondering what your thoughts on like Novalis was like. Specifically Navalis's quote, which I think could like provide good apologetic arguments. So like Navalis quotes, we always are like striving towards the unconditional, right? But we only find conditional things. And what Navalis is seeking like is through like different means of like aesthetics and poetry is a means to like translate the unconditioned into the conditioned things in some way. That like philosophy is an
Yeah.
active translation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there has some promise there. I need to look more into his work before I comment on it. I don't want to say anything unless I've not fully tried to understand what he's trying to argue.
Okay, yeah. I was just wondering what you thought about like aesthetic arguments in particular.
Yeah,
Do
I
you,
think they're interesting. I just have never used them.
do you hold to any like theory of art particular thinkers when it comes to your idealism?
I my idealism is going to align with people like Keith Ward, Bernardo Kastrup. Definitely, there was a book called Idealism: New Essays in Metaphysics. Definitely, that book was very influential. Susan Schneider in the book, I really did like her
Yeah,
the way she worded certain things. Yeah.
you really confused me because you said objective idealism, right? But objective idealism is
Hmm.
already a movement, right? And a movement in like was already a movement in like U.S. like pragmatism, right? So with like
Yeah, I
C.S.
know.
Pierce. Yeah, and I was like, oh, is he talking like a naive realist, like idealism? And then you start talking about
No.
appearances, like objects as appearances, which is like, oh, this is Castropian,
Yeah,
like
it's more
idealism.
in line with him. Yeah.
Yeah.
Speaking of Castrop, if I could break in for a second, we are working on getting an AMA going for Bernardo Castrop as well, so he'll be on the show, and I'll let you guys know when that's going to happen. So, yeah, I just thought I would throw that out there. I'm still working on the date with him, so we'll get that figured out and we'll get him added. Or I'm going to go ahead and take Brett as a call. Brett, good.
Woohoo! I'll talk to you later,
Woo!
Tart. Peace.
See you later, man.
Mhm.
Move you back to the crowd and then move you in. Hey there, Brett. How are you?
Good, guys. Can you hear me okay?
We can, loud and clear. What kind of questions do you have for Michael?
Well, hope everyone's doing well tonight. I tried to take a minute to word this, to write it down, but I do have a few things going on, so I'm just going to try to get to the point. So, Michael, one of my concerns with humanity right now is I think humanity is on the verge of discovering what it needs to do for the future in order for the species to move on, and to thrive in the future. At least I hope it can. But I actually see. I wouldn't say I see organized religion as fundamentally one of the issues, but I do. I do have a problem with how organized religions, like many other topics, um, don't really do a good job at acknowledging that part of human civilization's role to function is to literally see other people as valuable as yourself. Um, and with Islam, Christianity, or other religions, making the claim that this is the truth, right? This is the only one that is the way. I'm wondering how your perspective is on how that kind of message leads. I don't know if that's what you believe or that's what you preach, but how that leads to a sustainable future. Because for me, it doesn't. It doesn't. As an amateur historian, it doesn't. I don't see that leading to any place but perpetual violence. Um, because people claim that they are good in following their religion, and yet it's humans who have claimed the same thing through history and still not figured out how to end things like cyclical violence and warfare. Not all based on religion, but enough of it to where it's significant. Does that make sense, or was that too many points?
No, I mean, I did a video in 2022 called "Does Christianity Cause War and Violence?" and the data does not support that it does lead to violence. There was a study done called The Influence of Religion on Interstate Armed Conflict, Government Religious Preference, and First Use of Force, 1946 to 2002. They looked at three religions, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam, and they found that Islam is positively associated with more interstate armed conflict. Buddhism is non-significant, but Christianity was negatively correlated with interstate armed conflict. Another historian, or an historian named William Cavanaugh, wrote a really influential book that most historians follow now called The Myth of Religious Violence, and he focused in on European conflicts and argued that most of these conflicts were not religiously motivated, if at all. They were motivated more by political situations. If anything, Christian religiosity was decreasing the violence throughout the European conflicts. It was not exasperating it, I guess is the word I'm looking for. Others work I did in a video called Is Christianity Harmful? Numerous studies have shown that Christian religiosity leads to a decrease in aggression, violence, domestic abuse, all sorts of various crimes, and this has been shown in meta-analysis after meta-analysis. For study after study, I could cite. Like there's one like religiousness and aggression in adolescence. Religiosity corresponds with lower levels of direct and indirect aggression. Another study called Religiosity and Moral Identity shows intrinsic religiosity facilitates and increases self-control. And again, I cite dozens of studies in that video.
So the United States being a mostly Christian nation and settling the continent, like I assume you're going to say that the conflict with the Native Americans and calling them heathens and justifying westward expansion, you're going to take Christianity off the hook for that?
Well, I mean, we have to look at a very complicated history and political and cultural situation. When the first Pilgrims came over, they were not colonistic in mindset. There's a great book I did called New England Frontier. I can get you the author here in a minute. I did a video on it, I think, about a year ago or so. But basically, he pointed out that when they came over, they were not colonizing land. Most of the land they acquired was sold to them by the inhabitants there because they had so much extra land due to the prior to the Pilgrims showing up. It was basically wiped out by plague after plague. So when the Pilgrims showed up, the Native Americans were more than happy to give them land in exchange for tools and modern weapons. In fact, the Pilgrims were quite ethical in how they treated them. They allowed Indian testimony to be sworn in, even if it wasn't sworn on a Bible. So they were allowing the Native Americans to keep their religious identity, their spiritual beliefs, without becoming Christian. They would let testimony be sworn in without them becoming Christian. They did not forcibly take their land. A lot of it was sold to them. They treated them with a lot more respect than a lot of the more capitalistic mindsets that were coming down in the further south that were not motivated by trying to establish religious ideas. They came up with an entire written language for Algonquian for them, offered to bring them by colonists and moving into settled lands and kicking them off of there. I mean, Andrew Jackson's Trail of Tears is a very obvious example. But to say that it was religiously motivated, that Christianity was causing this, that is another stretch. We need to actually show data showing that it would lead to
that. We won't have enough time to discuss this because I have to go to another phone call, but that's the exact argument I would make. I'm not trying to downplay your interpretation of the Pilgrims there, but I think that's the what are the two words? That's the exception and not the norm. Well, secondly, I can't. Sorry, brother, not to be rude. I can't discuss it with you right now because I literally have to take a family phone call in 3 minutes. I mean, if you want to respond to that, I'm not trying to be aggressive with that, but I'm fully on the other side of that. That's not. I think that it's great that pockets of that worked to where the humanity did show through, but it perpetually throughout the founding of the United States, Indians are not equal. That's not, they are the other group, and every treaty that was created with them was basically broken. Now, I'm not saying that's Christianity necessarily doing that, but again, sorry, I already got into it and said I wouldn't.
No,
So
I'm not denying anything you just said there. My
yeah,
pushback would be that's not caused by Christianity, and I can cite
yeah,
meta-analytical research that I've cited on my channel showing that Christianity does not correlate with increased levels of racism, ethnocentrism, prejudice, and some studies
whoa,
even show it's pointing in the opposite
no,
direction.
but
Hold on,
brother,
hold on, hold
hold
on.
on, brother.
You have to,
Scott,
you
I
have to.
got it. Scott, I got it. How many times in white churches throughout the United States history did they say that African Americans were inferior or that Native Americans were inferior?
Again, I would say correlation is not causation. You need to actually
I
show that
know,
that's being
but
caused by
people,
Christian. And I can,
yeah,
and that's just
yeah,
citing anecdotal data. I can cite actual meta-analytical
that's
research showing this.
that's the religion being played out by people just like today, where any person that actually claims to be of the religion is, it's not the thing of the religion doesn't get excused from it. It's that the separation again of the the acknowledgement that, or the non-acknowledgement that not that people are who are not in the given tribe are therefore not equal. And so that to me is a fundamental point where they justify, it's not just Christians, I give you that. It's organized religion that justifies to say that the other is not equal to us.
Yeah.
Like, and that is essentially what Jackson said. Yeah, like you said, I know you had a good point there. Scott, I cut you off though. I'm sorry about that, man.
No, you pretty much hit the notes that I was going down. I was going to bring up the notion, like meta-analysis is only as good as the worst study that you're analyzing, right? So like meta-analysis is typically in the world of understanding human interactions about as useful as an asshole on your elbow, right? Like this is just something that it's not really used for in sociology. Meta-analysis.
Meta-analyses are used quite often in sociology. I
Uh,
talked to a sociologist, Kenneth Vaughn. He says
yeah,
they're used often.
but you're missing my point because like people use it, but they're not using it in the way that you're using it. People use it to try and see if there is any greater trend, but that does not mean that saying like, oh, well, I've seen the meta-analysis and there's no leading of how religious anybody is towards this kind of behavior when obviously there is, right? The more religious people, the more religious somebody is, their behavior is going to be represented by the amount of religiosity that they have.
Okay, again, what you're saying it's just obvious. My question is what data shows that intrinsic Christian religiosity leads to more racism and prejudice? If you don't have any data, how can you just say it's obvious when I can show sociological data showing the opposite?
Yeah. I just pulled it up right here. So this is from William T. Cavanaugh. Let's drop some names again here. Everybody
The
knows that
myth
religion has a dangerous tendency to promote violence. The story is part of conventional wisdom in Western societies that underlines legal institution and policies from limits on the public role to religion to efforts to promote democracy in the Middle East.
William T. Cavanaugh is an historian, not a sociologist, and he's the guy that wrote the book The Myth of Religious Violence.
Yes,
William T. Kavanaugh is a Catholic,
I know.
Yeah.
and so he's not arguing against religion at all. In fact, he would be arguing for the papacy if he's a good Catholic.
No. If you actually read what he's saying, he's not saying either or, right? So like it seems to me that you're saying is because somebody is Christian that they are less likely to be violent, right? And there's no
I'm
there's
saying I'm not saying that. I'm saying the studies show intrinsic religiosity that draw from heavy Christian populations and their sample sizes show that Christian religiosity correlates with decreased aggression and violence.
yeah, that's when is that based off of though, right?
Do you want me to give you all the studies?
So are we just talking about one specific time period?
I'm talking about all the latest research.
All the latest research.
Yeah.
You're missing my point, man. Like I'm not, I literally am not saying you're fucking wrong, somebody else is right. I'm just saying I think you might be incorrect in coming to this specific conclusion that believing in Christianity makes people less violent. I think it has nothing to do with Christianity, which is sort of where you were going earlier. But then you sort of like double back down to like the point of being like, well, no, Christians are less violent, and it's
No, I didn't say
you're
that.
using a double.
I didn't say that. I did not say Christians are less violent.
It seems to be that's what you're presenting.
No, I'm not arguing for Christians. I'm arguing against the idea that Christian religiosity would lead to negative outcomes. You got to distinguish between Christian religiosity and Christians themselves. You can observe negative behavior in Christians, just like you can observe negative behavior in vegans. That does not mean veganism caused their negative behavior.
Yes,
We need to focus on different measures, different motivations in people itself. My argument has always been to defend Christian religiosity because that's what the data defends.
Yeah, but you do think Muslim religiosity indicates violence?
No, because the data does not bear that out.
Okay, yeah. I thought that you said something along those lines earlier.
No. Here's what I said earlier. I said there's a study that showed that on a national level, Christianity correlates with a decrease in interstate armed conflict. Islam correlates with an increase in interstate armed conflict. However, there's a lot of other studies that show that on individual levels, Islamic religiosity correlates with less violence and aggression as well.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that's fair.
Okay.
I mean,
Fantastic.
to me, I don't apply it as to having anything to do with religion, right? I mean, wars, like I was in the army, and you know what they told us? Wars aren't fought over ideas. Wars are fought over resources. And to me, it seems like that's a pretty fucking solid standard across the board whenever you look at shit that's going fucked up.
No, I absolutely agree. That's typically what causes wars. I would
Couldn't
not
you
disagree with that at
hypothetically
all.
say that it's because of less religion, because we moved away from religious worldview, the more
No.
society became
I-
civil? And it's not because of religion; it's despite of it.
No,
So
that's wrong, Nick.
Yeah, I moved to the caller, so I didn't dominate the panel. So anyway, I agree with you, Michael, in a way, but I also disagree in some other ways, and I would state that the culture of the West today is indeed religious, which is I think why you have what I would consider to be a true holy or culture war between two religions. Would you disagree with that?
Yes, I would disagree with it because I don't think the culture is necessarily as religious. What some research has shown is that a lot of what has happened in the West as of late is taking Christian symbols and reinterpreting them in sort of like these political right-wing ways. So this is where we see the rise of Christian nationalism. And sociologists like Kenneth Vaughan, Philip Gorski, Roger Brubaker have noted that what's sort of happening is Christian nationalism or Christian civilizationism is rising as it moves away from religiosity but takes the Christian symbols with them and reinterprets them in political ways. Christianity is reinterpreted as a matrix for this political identity, this cultural identity, not necessarily the religious aspect. So Philip Gorski says they've been loose from their religious moorings and they become something entirely different. I did a video on this with sociologists.
I'm not arguing that point. I think I should make it more clear. It is indeed. So the issue that we're coming up against in the way, and Brett was a good example of that, and so is Scott, as far as I'm concerned, is a religious war. So in other words, the state has become and is religious in many cases. You have a religion of the self. This is a religious war. So you have people basically, like you said, commandeering symbols and using them as their religion. And so you have, I think Dr. Peter Jones has a great documentary on this. There's only two religions, right? There's Christianity and everyone else. And this is another religion. It is indeed an authoritative issue. We're fighting religions on both fronts.
That's different from religion, though, right? Religion is specifically referring to something that has supernatural powers. It's like it's calling to some sort of being that has powers that exist outside of the natural realm.
No, I would disagree. The religions are not entirely. Well, in a way, they're supernatural, but they're denying the supernatural and imposing a material to replace the supernatural. And so, so in other words, if you talk to somebody, it's largely a naturalistic argument in a position from religion. And it requires a claim of belief or well placed belief, as they might say it. But
Yep.
it is truly two ideologies.
Yeah, well, to me, you know me, Bruce. I mean, like we can go back to the beginning, and like if we're going to the self-caused idea, right? Like we're both going back to some point where we can't go back any further. One side says, "Oh, that's because there's a supernatural being that created everything," and I just say, "I don't fucking know," right? I mean, to me, I think if you're going to go down the line of saying we can look at all this information and recognize as it goes back this way, aha, I have the answer, when there's no possible fucking way you could have the answer, that's a problem to me.
This is an ideological position, though. It's a position that states there is indeed no way. That's a position. So that would be a bold claim to state there is no way. That's saying there isn't anyway.
I would say there's no way based on empirical data, right?
Right. So now we're back to the religion of materialism. That's all we're doing.
I mean, there is a historian named Nathan Johnstone who talked about this in his book on New Atheism, and he pointed out that a lot of historians actually think the Nazis started a political religion. They took symbols from German history, Christianity, even paganism, and they reinterpreted them in political ways to create a political religion. So it's very likely that you can get these sort of like materialistic or these naturalistic religions, or political religions as they're more likely called, where they're focused on material aspects and not necessarily a supernatural aspect. William Cavanaugh, in his book, The Myth of Religious Violence, notes how hard it is to even define what religion even is.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean,
that's why I think there's a miscommunication in calling these things religions, right? So, like, you can talk about the state, and people are like, the religion of the state. And I know it's like a good placeholder, and the reason Christians want to do that is because it places things on the same scale. It says, well, your belief in this is just the same as my belief in this, right? But there's a differentiation of veracity of information of what we can know, right? I mean, these are the important things to me, is like, what can we actually know? And when it comes to religion, there's nothing we can actually know. It's just like, oh, this is the way I feel. I feel this way about this thing, so it has to be true.
Yeah, I think Michael's making the other argument and making a more empirical argument, but what I mean, go ahead. Sorry.
I mean, yeah, I'm an Aristotelian in a lot of ways. I'm going to try to rely on what happens in the natural world as much as I can to make my argument. And even early church fathers argued nature was just the 67th book of scripture. So I very much do argue from empirical facts a lot.
But
yeah, I was going to ask that actually.
I would say, like, to me, it seems like your fundamental argument, though, is like, if you're relying on the natural world and this is what's actually important, and you're just saying, okay, well, we don't know where it came from, so therefore God, right?
That's not at all what I'm saying now.
So what's the thrust then? If we're all relying on natural information, things that human beings are able to abduce and understand about our environment, why is a God needed for you when it's not needed for somebody else?
Well, I mean, my arguments from God are not arguing from sociology. I argue from natural theology. So I argue from, cosmological arguments, moral arguments, teleological arguments, consciousness arguments. I think the best explanation in a lot of ways would be a immaterial mind that is governing and controlling and created the universe. I think this is the best explanation of the data.
But do you know that for sure? Is this something that you find exactly? So it's something that we find ourselves in a position where we don't have the answer for it, right?
We don't have the answer for anything then, if that's the case. That's the criteria. I mean, the only thing you can really prove is that your consciousness and you're experiencing something, but everything else is inference beyond that.
Well, I'm talking about like empirical knowledge, right? Like we do know certain things based on empiricism, And granted, yes, we just have to accept this as being true because it is going to go down to a point where that's just what you have. You have your fundamental axioms, right? My fundamental axiom does not include God. Like, I don't need some sort of supernatural being to say this is why this is. I can say we have morals because this is the way human beings have evolved over millions of years. And the ones that survived, the ones that passed on their genes, are the ones that were better able to work with each other, right? I mean, everything can also be answered naturalistically. So then, why do we even need a God?
Well, I mean, you're confusing the psychological aspect of morality with the ontological aspect. Just because humans evolved a certain way, like we evolved to eventually study and learn math and science, that does not mean it just simply reduces to just a psychological aspect of us. We're really discovering real aspects of the world. I would say the same thing with morality. We evolved a certain way to understand the moral landscape, to understand the moral reality. And that then points ontologically to some sort of necessary mind that governs these sort of objective prescriptions that we have evolved to learn and discover.
The question I have for you that I was going to go into, Michael, was, and I'm trying my best not to get into a theological debate because it's not the forum for that, as you might agree. But I'm just curious, like, how does it follow in your apologetic method that Christianity would be the position you would take? So, in other words, what's your standard?
My standard is I would use basic epistemology. I would argue beginning with, for example, coherence theory of truth. When it comes to justification, I'm a foundationalist. And so I would basically start there in terms of, I would vary between internalism and externalism on different forms of knowledge. So I start with that. And once I get there, then I start doing metaphysics. Once I get through my metaphysics.
Right. How are you defending the God of the Bible, though?
Through classical apologetical approach, where I argue from empirical and reasonable arguments that can be deduced.
Right, but you're reasoning from not the Bible, right? Or Scripture, the special revelation of God, right? You're reasoning from the natural experience.
Well, I have to start with that. That's how you have to do your own epistemology first before you can even know what knowledge is. How do I know what truth is if I don't understand different theories of truth, like correspondence versus coherence theory of truth?
Right. But I think that what I'm trying to say is that's second order. First order would be, if you're going to defend Christianity, you have to come with a worldview, right, that is holding Scripture as ultimate. Otherwise, you would then be reasoning to Scripture, and then you can indeed make Scripture say what you want it to say from your natural epistemology, as opposed to a revelational epistemology.
I mean, if that's the case, I could do the same thing with revelation. I could say whatever revelation I've revealed that's been revealed to me is the truth.
Correct.
You can do that with revelation that's revealed to you as the truth, but you must still have a starting point as to what indeed invokes God of the Bible and gives you all of the knowledge that you have about what God is, the triune God, unless, of course, you're not stating that you are a believer in the triune God.
So you're a Calvinist, right?
Correct.
What if I say it's the Catholic tradition and the Catholic interpretation of Scripture?
Then you're appealing to a fallible man.
No, I'm appealing to Scripture, and I'm appealing to the authorities the apostles have been handed down that it can interpret it properly.
Yeah, where's the interpretation, though? See, the issue of Catholicism is the issue of authority. It's not an issue of Christ in that particular argument.
Right.
See, I'm trying not to get into a theological argument here because I don't think that's good in this.
Everyone's going to appeal to an authority. I would just reject your authority to interpret it properly. I mean, that just works the same way.
Well, wouldn't you say that there's three interpretations, yours, mine, and the right one, right?
I mean, in a colloquial sense, sure.
Yeah, and so you would then say that there is only one true interpretation of special revelation, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay, I'm gonna let the other guy get in the caller. I'm taking up all this space here. I don't want to get you. I'll talk to you another time.
I
about
can bring you up. I
theology.
can bring you up to the speakers tab because it still might be interesting. Like after Lance speaks with him to continue going on because I'd be curious to hear a conversation because I know Michael has some different views when it comes to as far as I understand when it comes to like presuppositional apologetics. I'd be curious to hear like what his objections are and how Bruce would respond. So I'm going to go ahead and invite you up to the speaker, and then I'm going to take the next caller, and then we can always come circle back around because I'd be curious to see what the interaction is like if you have time.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, let's take Lance. See what Lance has to add to the conversation. Hey there, Lance. What kind of questions do you have for Michael so far?
Hey, Tart, how you doing? I have a specific question, but so I believe in God, in a like a deistic sense. And a big problem with organized religion, even when I would have called myself an atheist a bunch of years ago, I put out a magazine, and if I had done another issue, which kept it going, I was going to have a column or whatever about what was happening in the religious community because they're an important part of working class populist thing, that I was trying to do with art and music. It wasn't a populist thing, whatever. But, so I'm not anti-organized religion. What my conception of God is comes from more of just a philosophical, cosmological. It doesn't come from religion at all, like born again God, born again Jesus. But here's what I would say. It's a leap of faith. Now, if you know who Gödel is, the mathematician, Godel.
Yeah, I know.
Well, the incompleteness theorem. Now, that blew people's minds. And like a lot of things, there's a lot of philosophical ramifications of cosmological discoveries of black holes and quantum, it all kind of overlaps and bleeds into each other. And to freak people out, not just in the math community, the idea that there's things that we can be absolutely certain of, but we can't prove. Well, that's a leap of faith in math. That's kind of scary, in a sense, to oversimplify. And so, as Soren Kierkegaard said, who wrote Attack on Christendom, as a completely devout Christian in a kind of C.S. Lewisy in the old days version of, criticizing something that he very much thought was being ruined. He was a devout Christian, as much as people think he might not that don't know. And he talked about the leap of faith. You're just never going to know. But I think, frankly, there are things in science. And because I think that when you go from Newton to Einstein to now, I think we have more questions, and they all knew they were, solving a few things and answering more questions, asking more. I think we're going to have to relearn a lot of the things we already think we know scientifically. And I think there's more things that we don't know and that we know we don't know, kind of, that we sense that we don't know than we've ever figured out up to this point. So I think we're in like kind of a post-enlightenment that we're just going to keep learning stuff and we're going to keep finding out more and more things that we just don't know. One more thing, of course, the idea of God and all this stuff. Okay, so other than the bubbling brew of lava, once Earth had, water and everything in life, we've been here for about 20 seconds. So of course, how can we conceive of God other than from a human-centric point of view? But I don't think of it that way. I think of it more of an entity, that is, it has to have certain qualities, and I can go into that in the next round, but without pancaking too many things together. But so I think that we're going to have a leap of faith, but I think that's going to be true in science to a certain extent, that there are things that we're just never going to quite know. We're just going to have to do what Goodell said, kind of prove it, but not be certain about it. It's going to be outside the set of things we can absolutely prove. We're going to have more and more of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, but here's the difference, Lance. Like taking a leap of faith, right? So it would be a leap of faith that said, "Hey, if I go to Chick-fil-A tomorrow, when I get there, I'll be able to get a chicken sandwich." Why do I say that? Because every time I go to Chick-fil-A, I can get a chicken sandwich. Now, there could be a possible situation where I get there and all the chicken's gone, right? There's no chicken sandwich to be had anywhere. That's a far different fucking claim than saying there's a supernatural being that created everything. He cares about us. He knows everything. I mean,
They didn't say any of those things. None of those things are what I conceive of as God. None of those things.
So yeah, but you're like a pantheist, right, Lance?
No, I haven't told you what my conception of God is yet. It's had nothing to do with religious versions. Like I just said, humans have been here for 10 seconds, like a millisecond. It had nothing to do with our conception of like justice and law. It has to do with rhythms and music and pulses and symmetry and things that we don't, it's got a morals or ethics or any of that stuff.
All right. Yeah. So you're just saying God is the thing that put things in motion? Is that your position?
No, not just that. And I think what it does is as just as an entity, like a pulsing thing, because people do talk about these certain notes,
like a
combinations of notes. And music, I believe, is the highest form of communication among humans. But you take it to this level of, where it's more like to keep things in symmetry. Why is everything symmetric? Obviously, not everything is. There could be a rock, but everything that we look at, like cabbage and fruits and people and humans, symmetry is a hugely important thing. So I think it's this entity that doesn't have to know everything, but it has to be omnipresent. I don't think it has to be omniscient. I don't think it has to be all smart. I think it has to be, self-aware, and I think it has to be everywhere. Because you can't say, well, no, God exists here but not there. So I have to have certain qualities, but I think it's about keeping them the universe in kind of a rhythm, kind of a symmetry, kind of a pulsing, kind of a thing, and it kind of does it without thinking in the same way that we think of conscious human thought.
Okay, but once you say that, if you say,
hey guys, if I could, sorry, I'm sorry to jump in here. I do appreciate Scott and Lance's interaction, but we are taking up Michael's time, so I want to have him sort of respond, and then I'll move on to Nightclot, and then we'll wrap it up so we can give Michael his night back. Like I said, I do appreciate you guys' interaction, but I do want this is an AMA with Michael, and we are taking up his time. I don't want to be fair to him. So Lance, if I could, I'm going to move you back down to the crowd. I'm going to go ahead and take Mark's call, and then we'll wrap up with Michael here on that one. Or if you have extra time, Michael, you're more than welcome to stay on and continue the conversation. Entirely up to you. I just don't want to take up your time with two guys, talking when it's really I wanted to hear your position, your perspective a little bit more.
Yeah, I gotta go soon because I gotta put my daughter to bed. But yeah, appreciate it.
Do you think you have time for one more caller, or just Mark to
Yeah,
ask
one more
a question
time.
and then move on from that? Okay, Lance, I'm gonna move you down. Okay.
Okay.
Hey there, Mark. How are you?
Hold on, is this working now? Am I coming through or not?
You're there. You're there. Yeah. What kind of questions do you have for Michael?
Yeah, my question is this. I heard you said you're Catholic, and so what would be your response to someone like me? Like, for example, I would probably agree with a lot of the natural arguments that you use, the Neoplatonic argument, the Aristotelian argument, but I come to something like the Vedic Brahman as the ultimate reality. So I look in the world, and let's say if I start from that Kantian starting point of space, time, and thought, I see things like being consciousness and bliss as the foundation for that. So this is what I get to. And it's something that kind of seems more intelligible or more makes sense than some sort of what I would call vague abstraction of a trinity. So I don't really feel there's anything inherent within Christianity that compels me to believe it. And one of the things I've noticed is one, and I've talked with Tart about this, and he can venture through this. A lot of it actually comes from the behavior of Christians itself, because sometimes we're in these servers in Discord. And one of the things that I found to be I don't like about this is the vicarious atonement, because a lot of these Christians feel that they control. Ephesians 5:4 would say not to troll. And then they say basically, well, Jesus died on the cross for my sins. There seems to be too much of this easy believism where they feel there's no duty or moral obligation placed upon them. And that's a thing that kind of irks me. That's why I kind of like the notion of karma. In a sense, I take that, again, Kant to his critique of practical reason, where, again, duty implies freedom, ought implies a can. I can achieve the highest degree of virtue, and God is a synthetic a priori, or the tie-in between virtue and happiness. I find that this vicarious atonement allows for too much of an easy believism in the sense that, oops, I'm sorry, I messed up. Can you please forgive me, Jesus? So that's one of the things. I don't feel that Christianity kind of affirms, let's say, morality or the sense of freedom and action to the degree something like karma and reincarnation would.
Okay, well, let's. There's a lot there. First, I didn't say I was Catholic. I just use it as like an analogy to compare with Calvinism. I keep that my denominational preferences private.
Okay.
With comes to arguments for Christianity, again, I would agree with you a lot when it comes to basic theism. No disagreement there, especially being that I'm an idealist. If I was going to argue for Christianity, I would argue for the truth of Christianity from the resurrection evidence itself. When it comes to the issue with vicarious suffering for sins, Yeah, I would agree that some Christians seem to misunderstand that. The idea of the atonement is the idea that Jesus dies for our sins, but then we are grafted under him. He becomes our new priest and our Lord, and accepting him as Lord means we have to do what he commands of us. So it's not this idea that he dies for our sins and we get to do what we want. He pays the penalty for our sins, but then we are eternally indebted to him as our new Lord and King and Savior. Therefore, Paul uses this language of the ancient world of patrons and clients. Jesus becomes our patron and we are his clients. And in the ancient world, if your patron called on you to do something, you served him. We do it out of gratitude for him saving us, not because it saves us it's through like a works-based salvation, but still because Jesus is now our Lord and patron, we are now called to serve him in multiple ways. So this is what the letter that James sends out talks about, is that faith without works is dead. The works we do is a manifestation of the faith and showing that now the Holy Spirit lives in us. And finally, I would add that, yeah, you can interact with a lot of Christians that may come across as rude or vulgar. But again, anecdotal cases are not going to be a lot to convince me. If I'm going to go anywhere, I'm going to go to what the psychological and sociological data shows. And again, the overwhelming data, systematic review, meta-analysis, individual study after study after study, overwhelmingly shows Christian religiosity will lead to more conscientiousness, agreeableness, extroversion, and will lead to more self-control, pro-social behaviors. This has even been shown in priming studies, which directly tie into Christian religiosity, because Christians will be primed with like religious sermons, and then it shows more pro-social benefits from that thing. So it does seem that Christian religiosity very much often in study after study correlates with more positive benefits.
That'd be due to what you're talking about, the Western world. Like the Western world has less violence in a sense than the other thing. But again, wouldn't you say that it's complex if you look at us versus different parts of the world, and to associate the fact that, you know, the West tends to be more peaceful with other areas based completely about their religion? The atheist is going to sit there and say, no, when we were really Christian in the Middle Ages, we were more violent. It's Enlightenment values that caused this. So to me, that seems to be the case, that kind of reasoning that you're using, this is going to give kind of the atheist or the person who's pro-enlightenment say, no, it was basically the rejection of religion that created this more pro-social society. They're going to say, look at Scandinavia now. I mean, when they're kind of atheists, they tend to actually be less violent. So to me, I would actually go not towards these pro-social behaviors. I'm talking about phenomenologically a sense of duty. That's the thing I like, for example, about the Bhagavad Gita and its ideas in that. I feel in this dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna, there's a concept of duty. I don't get that in something like Christianity with the vicarious atonement. It seems as if, again, that concept of duty and the freedom associated with that. That's for some reason, not to brag at Scott, I would completely discount Calvinism, because Calvinism wouldn't even have that concept of freedom that goes along with duty.
I would disagree.
You're basically God's meat puppet. And if that's the case,
that's a mischaracterization.
And if that's the case, I just completely dismiss that because it doesn't have that.
That's a mischaracterization entirely. But this isn't a Calvinist discussion, so sorry.
I mean, I would say that I very much would go to the empirical data on this to see what actually bears out, because we can have all sorts of hypotheses, but just because we have hypotheses. Now, with regards to secularism, the data is actually not really bearing that out. There was a study done called Secular Tolerance, Anti-Muslim Sentiment in Western Europe, and they found that secular nations were on average more tolerant. However, they also said our findings indicate that although more secular countries are on average more tolerant towards Muslims and Islam, strongest anti-Muslim attitudes are nonetheless found among the non-religious in these countries.
You can make a
so
stat
the more tolerant
you can
people
make
in
a
these
stat
countries were actually among the religious in these Scandinavian countries.
That's fine.
You can make a
I know,
stat.
but that's fine. But overall, I guess the idea is Western society is becoming much more peaceful and less violent. Has been an arise with these kind of secular values. That's the case in history. Now, I wouldn't. Again, I'm not an atheist, but I think that actually.
Let me at least respond to that. Let me respond to that. No, this is a Steven Pinker argument that he's put out, and historians like Ted McCormick have actually gone after him, saying this is just not what happened. They've argued that actually a lot of Enlightenment values led to a lot of colonialism and oppressing of minorities across the world. Why? Because we are the enlightened. No, let me finish.
White man's burden to make them Christian.
Let me finish, sir.
Yeah, guys, don't interrupt.
Can I finish now? Is that okay? I let you talk. Let me finish. Okay. Very cute. Anyway, Ted McCormick notes that it was Enlightenment values that led to this idea that the European white man was superior than other these minority groups. And abolitionist movements at the same time were rising up because Christians were strongly convicted in Adamic unity. They were very much fighting against this ideas. This isn't coming from me. Ted McCormick and Tim O'Neill talked about this in an interview, and these were both were atheists, for example, pointing this type of stuff out. It was Christian idea of Adamic unity, Christian brotherhood that fought against a lot of these Enlightenment ideas. The Enlightenment also led to the French Revolution, which again led to things like the Great Terror. It was not all sunshine and rainbows. This is a Steven Pinker myth that has been strongly debunked by historians at large. So no, and a lot of other things is there's been research done by people like Robert Woodbury, Ronald to Salem, that have noted that it was Christian missionary activity that led to things like the spread of democracy, mass education, mass printing, and in colonial reforms. All this thing has been published in studies, which I've talked about on my channel. This is actually what the data shows.
Yeah, but the problem is, Michael's, none of that data actually shows that God's real. So we can go over.
That's not what I argued.
Correlation doesn't equal causation.
Well, that's the whole thrust of your argument. Whether you're trying to like break things down into certain compartments here and there, like the whole thrust of your argument is that God is real, right? Like you consider yourself a Christian, right?
I'm arguing a difference between the practical application and the true application. Something can be practical and useful and still be false. Likewise, something can be true and not useful. So just because I argue that Christianity has been beneficial in a lot of ways, that doesn't mean I'm arguing this therefore proves it's true.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
Can't good come from wrongs be made as well? I mean, you give it off an interpretation as if good came from the guidance of religion, but it could have come from the failures of it. Like with the Black Death Plague, people were massacring other people because they believe God was punishing them because they weren't living morally in society and as a cause of the plague, and it led to people burning other people in massacres and as a blame for blame for it. It's the ignorance. It's the ignorance of religion that made the result of moving more away from atrocities that made society move more away from a religious worldview to a view of reasoning.
Well, that's not true, Nev, because like people who aren't religious can commit atrocities just as well, right? And that's what I was asking Michael, because I thought based on everything he said, he was getting to the point that said because we're Christian that we are not immoral. But he said that's not the statement he was making. So to me, that comes back to the situation. Like, what is your actual? Because you're talking about empirical evidence. What actual empirical evidence do you have then for there being a God?
My evidence comes from different areas. I argue for. As I started with this hangout, I talk about the emergent universe argument, which I present using our data from quantum field theory, quantum mechanics, cosmology. I also use arguments from consciousness. I use the moral argument. I can use teleological arguments. So that's what I would argue for a God.
Yeah, but you do recognize like any argument that you pop out that you can say, okay, the argument of origins, right? It's not just it's not a wholly agreed upon kind of thing, right? These things are not the same as like chemistry and mathematics and physics and like chemical engineering, right? Like chemical engineering, like if you do these certain things, I have a certain amount of moles of something that I'm going to mix with another amount of moles of something, and we're going to have the same output every time, no matter what, as long as we're within like the certain amount of pascals of pressure, right? So it seems to me.
Yeah, you can verify certain physical processes.
That's what's
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, to me, that's what's empirical. Like, is when we actually have evidence that shows like the reason we know like matter is not like destroyed in any transaction is because a guy put a piece of wood in a fucking glass container and weighed it, lit the thing on fire. The only thing that was left in there was smoke, and it weighed the same mass wise, right? So we know it was just this wood went from being this hard thing to a gaseous material, but it still weighed the same, right? To me, this is empirical data. But if we're talking
Okay.
about the way somebody feels about something, there's nothing empirical about that at all.
I mean, I can expand that though, because you're just talking about physical processes. But within science, there's debate about interpretations, like quantum mechanics. There's various interpretations of quantum mechanics. There's debates about the theory of evolution. Some lean more towards the functionalist side. Some lean towards the structuralist side. So, I mean, you can have debates about that kind of stuff. And I'm just saying, similarly, when it comes to metaphysical worldviews, I would say the most coherent metaphysical worldview would be theism. It explains far more data with far less. So it's least ad hoc. It's more plausible. It can explain a lot of different phenomena with one explanation than a naturalist could.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. I get where you're going there.
Mm-hmm.
So if a god if a god is if what comes from God is of the mind, I have a mind. Would that mean I'm God?
No, that's not what.
What?
No,
No,
nobody's saying that, Nev.
no, but no, you said that what?
Nobody's saying that, Nev.
What? No, I thought he said like reality
No,
came
no,
from the mind
no.
of God. What's it called again?
It's not. It's not what's being
Divine
said.
Idealism?
conceptualism.
That's what it's called.
I mean, I would say God created everything. I mean,
Universe, I think.
I don't understand where you're going with this. Sorry.
So I do have a question. What is your bounds for what you would consider empirical?
That's a good question. I would say that it has to be detected by the five senses.
But even something that's detected by the five senses could not be empirical, right? Like I can listen to it.
Yeah, that's why it's
Yeah.
It's hard to say. I mean, we tend to say empirical is something you can see, but I mean, empirical tends to be something you can sense in a physical manner.
Well, to me, empirical is something that you can definitively measure, right? So if we're talking about measurements, and granted, I know like these kind of things will go down. Well, what's an actual foot? And like, yeah, of course, measurements are arbitrary and made up, but it's still something that we can use, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's hard to really define. This is just a failure of the verification principle of the 20th century, and why that has sort of that's fallen out in philosophy of science.
Yeah, but that's in philosophy of science, but in science it hasn't fallen out at all, right? Like like if I'm working with engineers and they're working on making parts for lasers and they need like light to refract at a certain fucking gradient at a certain degree, it only be this specific wavelength of light. You know what we can do? We can lay down a film to do that, right? So we have that is all calculable, and we get not only it's calculable, we can calculate it, put it in process, and have an actual output every time.
Yeah, I mean, that would be what we would call data in philosophy of science, but then you still have to deal with the theories aspect and the aspect of shaping principles itself. I mean, like, they were going to give like Lorentz the Nobel Prize for proving Einstein's theory, about 100 years ago, and he rejected Einstein's theory. He thought he actually debunked it. It was actually kind of a funny story where they were going to give him a Nobel Prize for proving Einstein, and he thought he actually debunked Einstein. It was all about the different theories they were positing.
Yep. But in that situation, so like even in that situation, imagine if you have somebody who they come out with a piece of work and they are 100% convinced this is debunking this information, but when every other scientist looks at it and says, "Oh no, this is a confirmation of this," what's more likely the case is that everybody else is wrong and that guy's right, or everybody else is right and that guy's wrong
I
about
mean,
his proof? not about the equations or anything. What about his specific opinion about it, right?
Yeah, I mean, then it just becomes probability and inference. And yeah, that's
Yes.
definitely a part of science. There's a really good book called For and Against Method by Emery Lakatos. And I would recommend the lectures of his in there because he sort of goes into a lot of that aspects.
But then
Okay, so
again,
I do want to give Michael his evening back. I really super appreciate you coming on the show, having a conversation with all of us. And I know at times it got a little heated. I'm very happy to see that you're willing to jump into the gladiatorial arena with your sword drawn. It's great to kind of see you go to battle. It's really fantastic, Michael. I really appreciate you having come on. But I don't want to take up too much more of your time. If you do have more time, there's one question that Lance was asking. He was wondering he was wondering about your take on, like, say for instance, if God is an omniscient being, like he's an all-knowing being, and there's
Yeah.
some if Gödel's incompleteness theorem is true, there's some things we can't have proof of, and so when we say something is like known, how do you deal with that with respect to God? Because it would seem in principle we couldn't like necessarily know those things because we wouldn't have proof of them, right?
With regards to God's omniscience?
Yeah, so if God was omniscient, how would God know, the whether or not, say for instance, one of the theorems that we in principle can't have a proof for, uh, how would he go about knowing, the true conditions for it or something like that?
Well, he would have omniscience. So, like you're talking about, like for Goldbach's conjecture, for example. Well, God would have actual infinite knowledge of the numbers and could know that this just goes on ad infinitum. So, someone with more complete knowledge would actually have knowledge of that kind of stuff. And just because we have limited knowledge in our scope doesn't mean there's not solutions out there for certain conjectures that we know in mathematics that just simply haven't been solved yet. God may be aware of those things. So it's very hard to sort of judge the status of an omniscient being from a non-omniscient standpoint, as if like there are no solvable solutions to those. I don't think that necessarily follows.
Okay, gotcha. And what would you say to like something like a physicist sort of objection? They would say like it's impossible in principle to know, for instance, the spin and the momentum of a particle or something to that effect. Can't remember how that whole thing plays out. But there's a there's like an issue with actually knowing it. Like I can't remember. I had a conversation with a
Yeah,
physicist, and I'm
well,
just
I mean,
curious how you think about it.
that's because when I say the wave function collapse, it either takes on one or two forms depending on how we measure it. And so you can't actually, so in one instance, it doesn't actually have a position, and in one, it doesn't actually have the same momentum. So it's on my view, because I take a more idealist approach, there isn't this idea that I don't believe in hidden variables, I guess you could say, that would be able to say how they would have both. That's something you would get on like, a pilot wave interpretation or some of the other ones, but I reject those interpretations.
but
Okay.
I was just going to ask, like you
I gotta
do.
go.
Yeah,
I gotta
like
go.
like I said, I'm trying to wrap things up, Scott. I really do appreciate the input. Thank you, Michael, so much. I'm gonna let you have your night back. I really
All
appreciate you
right, thank
coming
you.
on. Have a good one, man. Hey, guys, if you would like to continue the conversation, I'm going to go ahead and move this over to the Discord channel. I do want to let everybody have their kind of say in things and everything, and I do appreciate that everyone was so eager to interact with him. That it's fantastic. He really is a great guy. But he he is limited on time, and he was already being like really generous,
Oh
and I could
man.
sense his frustration, so I do want to let him go. But if you want to join us over on the Discord channel, I'm going to post a link to it in the chat really quickly for us, and then we'll move everything over there because I also myself I have to go as well. So, but thank you everyone for your very eager participation. It was fantastic to see everyone go toe to toe with him like that. So thank you guys so much. And here is that link for you if you want to join us over on the Discord.